Welcome, everybody, to the CFB All-America podcast. I am not Bill Trocchi. That is Bill Bender, but this is the CFB All-America podcast, and we are going to break down tonight's top 25 playoff rankings. Bill, I'm Brian Driscoll, filling in for Bill Trocchi, who is busy tonight with some responsibilities of sporting news, but quite a shakeup tonight in the CFB playoff rankings, Bill. We're going to dive into those, discuss the new rankings. There's obviously a new top four. There's three new teams in the top 25. And of course, there is a game coming up this weekend that I know you're going to have your eye on as someone who lives right in the middle of the state of Ohio that is going to have a big impact on the college football playoff rankings, Bill. But let's just quickly go through the top 25. You've got Liberty 25. They're the new team. We'll talk about them in a minute. Clemson 24, Tulane 23, NC State 22, Tennessee at number 21, Oklahoma State at 20. Kansas State at 19, Notre Dame at 18, Iowa at 17, Oregon State 16, Arizona 15, LSU 14, Oklahoma 13, Ole Miss 12, 11 Penn State, 10 Louisville, 9 Missouri, 8 Alabama, 7 Texas, 6 Oregon. And then you have the flip of Washington jumps up to number 4 with Florida State falling to number 5. And then your 1, 2, 3 stays the same. Georgia 1, Ohio State 2, Michigan number 3. First of all, Bill, just overall thoughts just on the top 25. We'll get into the Florida State, Washington stuff, but just some overall thoughts on what you saw from the rankings tonight.
Yeah, the deck is starting to be stacked, how they're going to do it. Liberty being in the top 25 is good. I don't think there should be 4 lost teams in the top 25, so putting Clemson and Tennessee in there, despite the way that Clemson's playing, I understand that. I mean, they're like you said, positioning teams so they can come to their final decision and have – it's almost like a lawyer case, right? That they can say, well, we had it like this. So, there's kind of that plausible deniability should chaos ensue.
The wild thing about it is when you look at the top 25 ranking and you could say, we'll talk Washington, Florida State here in a second, but you could say, well, Florida State's resume is not as good now because they lost to – or because because Washington beat Oregon State, which helps their resume, whatever. But you just jumped Clemson into the top 25, which means you have one more top 25 win now for Florida State. They now have 2. They also beat number 14 LSU. So the whole thing is just kind of odd when you look at it. There's multiple 4-loss teams in there. Tennessee with 4 losses is ranked ahead of both 1-loss Tulane and 1 undefeated Liberty, which is just a little wild to me. And then, and I know Clemson's playing well, but here's the thing I'll say, Bill. What's the resume for Clemson built on? Why are they in? It's not because they beat Georgia Tech and North Carolina alone. You also, because you beat Notre Dame, you dropped North Carolina out of the top 25. Their best win is now over Notre Dame. So they're in the top 25 as a 4-loss team. But does that win for Louisville or for Louisville over Notre Dame not affect their resume? Because they are the lowest ranked 1-loss Power 5 team, despite having a resume that includes multiple wins over top 25 teams, because they now have a win over number 18 Notre Dame, but now they also have a win over number 20 would be number 22 NC State, who jumped this weekend at 8-3. So a lot of it doesn't make sense to me.
Well, I mean, that part of it is for positioning a little bit. I had a feeling NC State would be ranked. We had them at 8-3, and you kind of start to stack up how many teams have 3 losses, how many have 4. Clemson's ranked because Tyler from Spartanburg called into their show and fired Sweeney up, and that's a storyline that everybody loves right now. And the Tigers have played pretty well since then. But it comes down to this. What I took from these rankings, and we might as well get into it now, is this Florida State-Washington thing where you and I know that they're coding it that it was an easy out for them to say Washington, we were impressed by them at Oregon State because they've beaten 3 ranked opponents. You can fall back on strength of victory. But part of it is about Jordan Travis being injured. And if they just would say, yeah, they're a different team with him.
Right.
Is this – so we get this a lot. I got that we could either do it this way. Is this JT Barrett going down for Ohio State in 14? Or is it Kenyon Martin going down for Cincinnati in 2000? I think it's more Kenyon Martin.
See, or Dennis, here's a better football example. Dennis Dixon going down in 07 for Oregon. a team that I think still plays for the BCS title game that year in 07 against Ohio State instead of LSU if Dennis Dixon doesn't get hurt, right? But my whole thing is, how about we let them play a couple games first? Like, here's the thing. It'll take care of itself if you just let it play out, because you're going to have a justification in a couple weeks of jumping Washington over them if Washington goes out and beats Oregon, right? I mean, that's kind of how I look at it. And then if Florida State goes out there and runs the table, beats Florida and beats Louisville, you know, what are you dropping them out for? My thing is, let's just see how they play first with him, because as you said, we have recent evidence of a quarterback going down late in the year for a good team and that team rallying and going out and winning a national championship, which we saw obviously with Cardale Jones. And that team jumped into the top 4 after JT Barrett got hurt, because they didn't jump until after the Big Ten title game. So my whole thing was like, if you're going to tell me, oh, it's about resume, well, I understand all that, but you just jumped a couple teams that Florida State has beat into the rankings, including a win over number 4, a 21-point win over number 14 LSU, where, yes, Washington has now 3 wins over ranked teams, but those wins combined don't equal the number of points that Florida State beat LSU, because Washington's won by 7, 2, and 3. Now, I'm not a mathematician, Bill, but I kind of think that's less than 21.
Right.
And that's my thing.
Well, Reese Davis on the show, when he was talking to Boo Corrigan, the committee chair, they were greasing the, you could kind of, with these shows, you kind of see, okay, what are they trying to prime for the next debate? And it's easy as, it's transparent as can be, that they're trying to set up, can a one-loss team jump an undefeated Florida State? Right. My answer would be 1,000% it won't happen.
It better not.
And if it did, it would just be admitting that we're just doing whatever we want to do.
Right.
So if Florida State beats Florida, and it doesn't matter how they do it. Now, one thing, and I'll get your thoughts on this. You're the X's and O's guy. I think Florida State, where this differs from JT Barrett, was Ohio State changed when Cardale Jones was quarterback because he could throw the ball a mile. Mm-hmm. He was able to stretch the defense with the deep ball probably more than JT Barrett. Wasn't the same running threat. I don't know what Florida State's going to be with Tate Rodemaker, other than, he's going to just have to be the same efficient quarterback that Jordan Travis is. But obviously, I think their offense will rein in a little more. But maybe not. He's got 2 pretty good receivers.
Yeah, I think he's a kid that can throw the ball down the field. You saw what happened. Again, North Alabama, right? So I don't want to say too much about it, but this is a kid that came in the game, and as I point out in our show today, Bill, that offense looked a whole lot better when Tate Rodemaker came in for Jordan Travis than it looked when Jordan Travis got hurt. I think he got hurt. They were losing 13-0, something along those lines when he got hurt. I believe it was early in the game. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. And then they ended up winning 58-13.
That's
right.
Not bad.
Right. And when you look at Florida State, my whole thing is that they are not who they are because of Jordan Travis, in my opinion. Jordan Travis is a good quarterback, but he's had better seasons recently. He's an efficient game manager this season. He's not running like he used to. He only has 176 rushing yards. For example, my point being, they don't rely on him the way that Michael Penix, like Washington relies on Michael Penix. They're more of Florida State's more like the 3 teams ahead of Washington, where their quarterbacks are doing some good things, but they're not undefeated because of their quarterbacks. Their quarterbacks are, pieces like cogs to the, to it. And that's my whole thing is, so let's just I just say, let it play out first. Yeah, but I do think you have to give merit to the fact that Washington has 3 wins over top 25 teams. Florida State has 2. And, so you can make that case. I just think they should have probably waited a week, to kind of do that. That way you can kind of get off some of the whole, we wanted to see how Florida State played. Right. That's my thing.
I'm fine with Washington ahead of them right now. And I think, it's just the idea that Florida State could slip behind like Oregon and whoever loses the Michigan Ohio State game is going to fall behind Florida State.
Should.
We'll see where we're at next Tuesday when we do this show. But that's a great point about Florida State. And we've watched, I remember the year they went to the national BCS championship game it was Thad Busby. They've had injuries before, and they've had that kind of cookie cutter quarterback that Rodemaker might be.
Right.
It might be a kind of like an old school 90s Florida State type team. So I definitely I'm okay with Washington being where they're at. I am impressed that they've gotten through this Pac-12 gauntlet
Yeah.
when for 4 weeks we've been sitting here saying Oregon's going to beat them anyway.
Yeah. I haven't been saying
I know I haven't either.
that. Here's the other thing for me, Bill, and this is my biggest observation, and just hear me out on this one, because I have a feeling I know what your reaction is going to be. My issue continues to be the lack of consistency in which they're applying the data. If you're going to tell me Washington is now should be ahead of Florida State because of the teams that they beat, then you also then have to look at their resume compared to Michigan's, because Florida State actually has more top 25 wins over Michigan. So I'm not sitting here saying I want to make the case for Washington over Michigan. That's a different conversation for a different type of debate. It's more of, if you're going to apply that, because now Washington's resume has improved, which is the argument they made, right? They didn't talk about the quarterback being hurt and all that. If you would have been more honest about that, then I'm not sitting here questioning, well, then why didn't they also leap Michigan? Because in the last 2 weeks, Michigan got a win, finally got a ranked win over a Penn State team, but their other 7-point win over a very unimpressive 6-5 Maryland team, right? So their resume to me doesn't stack up against Washington. So we just go back to this. Are we applying resumes? Are we applying eye test? What's the percentage of each? Because you can't make the case that Washington now deserves to move up based on who they beat if you're not going to apply that to every team ahead of them who they've beat. And that's
Right.
where I think it's just, I'd rather you just, to your point, I'd rather you just say, hey, listen, we're not sure if Florida State's the same team they are without Jordan Travis, and just say that.
Yeah, just come out and say it. Be
Right.
honest. Like, if you want to put Washington over Michigan, that's fine. Or by resume, that's fine.
Right.
But when you were listening to this ESPN show, Joey Galloway was pretty critical of Michigan, and he said they looked bad against Penn State. I was like, what? They ran the ball 32 straight times, and they just they kind of played that game conservative and went in and won in a tough place. They didn't look great last week, but they still won the game. So, I think we're going to learn all we need to learn about Michigan, and rather this suspension, I think it's impacting them more than people are leading on. I think it's impacting J.J. McCarthy a great deal, because he doesn't have Jim Harbaugh during a game to a former NFL quarterback to maybe walk through some things with. I think it's a huge deal this week too. But all of that, the Big Ten part of this puzzle is going to figure itself out, because the winner will probably go ahead and beat Iowa, and the loser will be out and go to the Orange Bowl. That's easy.
Right.
The Georgia-Alabama piece is a little harder to figure out.
Yeah, the Georgia-Alabama, there's two really interesting storylines to me, 3 interesting storylines, Bill, and we'll dive more into Michigan and Ohio State coming up. But there's still a lot of movement that's going to happen, because you've got the Alabama-Georgia game coming up in a couple weeks, and the SEC title game. Plus, you're going to have most likely have a Washington-Oregon rematch in 2 weeks. I believe Washington has clinched a spot, correct? Oregon has to win to get in.
Yeah, because Arizona is still in the mix.
Right, because they have 2 conference losses, right? I believe, yes. So that's going to be a very interesting
piece
talking point here, because how does Oregon factor in? Does Oregon automatically jump in if they beat Washington, because their resume isn't quite as strong as Washington's is overall? They'd have the win over Washington, but some of their other stuff because if they beat Oregon State, now Oregon State's a 4-loss team that's hanging on to the top 25, right? So it's going to be interesting to see how those things play out. And then, of course, you've got Florida State's got to play a top 10 Louisville team. What does that do to their resume? So there's a lot to still happen here these next 2 weeks. So this is by far not locked in stone.
I think of the 9 one-loss teams or less, Louisville's not going to go to the playoff no matter what they do.
No, and they shouldn't.
Which is fine, but they're still the fact that they're behind Missouri is kind of absurd.
It is very absurd.
And what do you think their logic is?
It's because I'm honestly, part of me wonders if it's just setting them up to kind of say, hey, look, if Florida State beats Louisville, we still have justification to keep Florida State out. Because I think what it comes down to is, if Alabama beats Georgia, I think the committee is going to just jump at the chance to jump Alabama in and still leave Georgia in. and now you have your justification for dropping Florida State out. But I'm looking at their schedule, and I don't know what the justification is, honestly. I mean, they have a 13-point win over a top 25 team in the ranking. They have a 13-10 road win over a team now ranked 22nd. You have 2 top 25 wins that Louisville is hanging their hats on. And, when I look at Missouri, I think Missouri is a good football team. I really do. And I think that's why they're to me, I think that's partly why they're keeping Tennessee in, because having Tennessee in justifies Missouri's ranking a little bit. But Missouri's ranked in the top 25 based on what wins, Bill. It's beating a Tennessee team that's now got 4 losses and shouldn't be ranked.
Florida
and beating Kansas State, right? Who is 19th
on a 60-yard field goal.
Right. Not nearly as convincing as the win Louisville had over Notre Dame, where they won by 13 points. And I believe Notre Dame scored last in that game. Right. So it's just that's been my biggest issue, Bill, is just the lack of overall consistency in the rankings with these teams. And, like, why is Penn State over Ole Miss? What's the win Penn State has to be ranked ahead of Ole Miss when Ole Miss has a win over number 14 LSU and number 23 Tulane? What's the justification for that, other than trying to maybe keep both of your Big Ten teams in? That's the other conversation. Is, are they trying to politic Penn State to keep in Iowa, like Iowa being 17th? That's for what? To boost up the resume of the Big Ten champ, So there's just a lot of this stuff that's just so easy to see what they're doing, but it continues to be the biggest issue. And I have been a supporter and a defender of the playoff committee for years, because I think in the past years, I think they've done a very good job of justifying teams. But this just reminds me a lot of 2014. It wasn't so much that they jumped Ohio State over TCU. It's the reasoning they tried to give us for it, because they not only dropped them below Ohio State, but then they dropped them below Baylor, and they tried to say it's because Baylor beat them head to head. And I'm like, that happened a month and a half ago.
Right.
Like, but since then, I think they've done a pretty good job with getting the 4 right. There have been some seeding discussions I could have with them, but I think they've got the 4 right most years.
Yeah, they do.
And that's my issue, is just the lack of consistency in which they're applying these rankings right now. And like, how is a 2-loss Missouri over a 1-loss Louisville team that has better wins? Again, Louisville has better. What's Missouri's best win? It's over number 19 Kansas State on a 60-yard field goal. What is Louisville's best win? It's a 13-point win over number 18 Notre Dame
at home.
Both at home. Both at home.
Good, right. Look good doing it too.
They never trailed in that game. Notre Dame, it was tied at halftime. No, Notre Dame took a 10-3 lead early in the third quarter, and then Louisville steamrolled them after that. Right. So it just how do you justify it? It just doesn't make a lot of sense how you justify it. And then you look, the second best win that Missouri has is better than Louisville's by 1 again. So you flip them. They say, okay, one team has 2 losses, one team has 1. So are we really going to say Missouri should be higher because they have better losses? I thought the committee has always said they don't care about who you lost to as much as they care about who you beat. Right. And that's the thing that drives me nuts. There's just so much inconsistent rankings. Like, how in the world is a 4-loss Tennessee team ahead of a 1-loss Tulane team? I mean, Tulane played a Big Ten team or an SEC team without their starting quarterback, Michael Pratt, and were more competitive in that game than Tennessee's been in a lot of their losses in recent weeks to SEC teams, right? Because they played Ole Miss. So
they should have Toledo ranked anyway over any. And I'm not even making a joke. Like, Toledo absolutely should be ranked over either one of these 4-loss teams, like they are in the AP Top 25. So I think consistency is an issue. They always favor the SEC. That's what they do. And as you look at this, so the way I kind of see the board is, okay, now we're down to 8 teams for 4 spots if we're crossing Louisville off. And, for Alabama, their fate isn't just the SEC. They really need Texas to lose one of these last 2 games, because otherwise there's no justification for, how do you say, okay, let's say Alabama beats Georgia. To me, it should be that could potentially lock the SEC out of the championship or the playoff if Texas wins both its games.
Right.
But it won't,
Right.
because you heard them talking about another thing that they're setting up, that if you, and I think your listeners are smart enough about this, that they're setting up the Georgia lose and still get in scenario.
Yeah. 100%.
Absolutely. It's plain as
100%.
day. And they'll say, well, they dominated for 12 weeks and they lost to the 8th
Right.
best team in the country.
That right there is why Missouri's 9th.
There you go.
I mean,
we figured it out.
That's it. That's why Tennessee is 21st. That's 100%. And that's the thing that drives me nuts, because I've heard people say this. Well, if Alabama beats Georgia, Alabama now has the best win in college football this year. And I'm like, no, they don't, because now Texas does.
Right. Because Texas beat the SEC champ.
Right. And they beat the team that beat Georgia. Exactly. Neutral site versus at Bama. And again, a game they won by 10 points and were clearly the better team in the fourth quarter. So the whole thing is just, and again, I don't want to hear the, well, like, how is Oregon ahead of Texas? Can we talk about that too? What's the justification for having Oregon ahead of Texas?
I'm less bothered by that one. I understand, like, Oregon doesn't have like a huge win. There's no doubt. Right. Like, they don't, but man, hey, look, and I'm guilty of doing this, Brian. We did it a little bit last week when we were going back and forth about Alabama and Florida State. I think Oregon will beat Texas, but that's not justification enough to rank Oregon over Texas. So
you think that Oregon would also beat Alabama?
I'm entertaining it. Yeah. Like, I think so. I mean, I like that offense. Now, granted, they could get in a game with Alabama and get out physical, because when is the last time a Pac-12 team really laid it to the SEC powerhouse? I'd have to go back and look.
I mean, I think the last time they got a non-conference win like that would probably be Ohio State 2 years ago, right?
Yeah, Oregon, like 2 years ago. Because what do we always talk about with those Pac-12 teams is, it's funny, Boo Corrigan talked about this as well tonight, is I always look at their trenches and say, is that going to matter when they go play Georgia? They did the Boo Corrigan, you talked about like weird rationale when he was talking about Washington. The most random stat he popped in there was their defense has looked good, really good, the last 6 quarters. I was like,
what are we talking about? Yeah.
What metric is that? What sortable was that one? That's pretty good one. They did look pretty good against Oregon State, but I'm thinking, yeah, that's not why I would have them number 4.
Right. It just, what frustrates me too is you're just making up criteria when you try to have that conversation, in my opinion. And it's like my issue with the eye test thing, from your opinion of so-and-so would beat so-and-so, who would be favored. Like, we don't know. You're now making, not you, just generally speaking, you are making rankings based off what you think might happen, instead of looking at what has actually happened and making the rankings based off that. Because when I look at Oregon, everybody says, well, if Oregon played so-and-so and so-and-so, if they played Washington again, they'd be favored. I'm like, that's fine. But all I know for a fact is that right now they played Oregon and beat Oregon. That's what I know happened. Now, maybe that changes in 2 weeks. I don't know the answer to that, but that's kind of my first. You think Texas would lose to Oregon, but we don't know that. What we know is that Texas went on. I'm not saying, I'm talking about more looking at the committee standpoint. Here's what I know. I know that Texas went on the road and beat Alabama convincingly. But it was a back and forth game for a while, but they were clearly the better team. I know that Texas has a win over a Kansas State team that you clearly think somehow justifies having Missouri with 2 losses, only 2 spots behind Texas at 7. Right? It just goes back to the overall consistency in which we see and what I continue to believe. We had this conversation on the show yesterday, Bill. There's still this thought of the SEC is the best conference of college football. And my whole thing is, you're only basing that off of what's happened in the past. You can't base that off anything that's happened this season on the football field. Because here's, like, for example, the best team in the Pac-12 right now, or excuse me, the best team in the Big 12 right now went and smacked on their campus a team that's playing for the SEC championship. The best team in the ACC smacked a team that you have ranked 14th by 3 touchdowns on a neutral field, right? I mean, you go down. North Carolina, who you just dropped out of the top 25, had a far more convincing win over South Carolina than Georgia did, who was losing to that team 14-3 at halftime of that game. So again, it just kind of goes back to we're just making up criteria and going with our feelings as opposed to looking at resumes and looking at statistical analysis and saying that team, deserves to be there. I know this team may beat so-and-so and such on a neutral field, but you get into that kind of conversation and we should have just 2 Big Ten teams and 2 SEC teams in the playoff every year, because that's always going to be the belief that, well, the best team from the Big Ten, the best team from the SEC, the 2 best teams could always beat anybody else's 2 best on a neutral field somewhere. So let's just go to the 2 conferences now and put their 2 best against the other 2 best, because at some point in time, what happens on the field has to matter, Bill.
Right. And well, speaking of which, Brandon, one of your commenters here, and I do want to ask your opinion on this one. So I'm gonna present it because everybody does these scenarios this time of year. Let's do this one for Brandon since he asked, and I'll set it up to you this way: Florida State wins out, Ohio State, Michigan wins out, Washington wins out. There's 3.
Mm-hmm.
Alabama beats Georgia, Texas wins out. The last 3, so you got your 3 unbeatens. So we got Washington, Ohio State. We'll say Ohio State. We'll just say they beat Michigan.
That's who I'm predicting to win. So
I did too. I said Ohio State 22-17.
And you said Florida State's the other.
Florida State. There's 3 unbeatens.
Mm-hmm.
Alabama beats Georgia by a touchdown. Okay. Who they taking for that last spot?
I mean, I think they go Bama.
I do too, which is wrong.
Yeah. I mean, how do you have them jump over Texas? Well, they beat Georgia. Okay. And Texas beat Alabama. Yeah. There's no way in heck they're leaving an SEC team out of the playoff. No way. Although you could argue they should. Right. Because what's Georgia's justification for staying in for this season? There isn't one. If they lose to Bama and there's 3 other undefeateds, they should be out. They should be out because I think Alabama at that point in time, Bill, has a better resume.
Right.
I mean, that's just the reality of it. Alabama would have the big win over Georgia. Georgia's best win is over Missouri. They have the better win there. When you look at Alabama, their loss is similar because you'd lose to a number 5 or 6 Texas team, right? Early in the season, everybody values, we pretend what happened in September doesn't matter anymore. Alabama would have a win over number 12 Ole Miss. So they'd have a win over number, let's say, 1 Georgia, number 12 Ole Miss. They'd have a win over number 14 LSU. They have a win over number 21 Tennessee. Right now, Alabama has 3 wins over top 25 teams. Georgia has 2. Right. And that would give Bama 4 wins over top 25 teams. And then they'd have an equal record. So, yeah, do I think Bama's better than Georgia? No. Would I say if they played again a week later on a neutral field, would I predict Georgia to win? Yes, I would. But I always say you're the champ until somebody beats you, and somebody beat them. And they don't have a good enough resume where to Alabama. Because here's the thing. If Alabama beats Georgia, but if Alabama would have just said, hey, we're going to schedule non-conference like Georgia did, then Alabama's 13-0. And we're not having this conversation.
Right.
Now, in Georgia's defense, they tried to schedule better. They were supposed to play Oklahoma this year, but the game got canceled by the conference because Oklahoma's joining the SEC. So I look at their non-conference differently than Michigan's because they didn't intend to schedule this soft of a non-conference. And it's not their fault the SEC East is down this year. But you can't keep Alabama and SEC and Alabama both in if you have 3 undefeated. So if you're an SEC homer, you got to be praying for Oregon to beat or Oregon or Washington State to beat Washington. Got to be praying for Florida or Louisville to beat Florida State, and you've got to be hoping that one of those two of those things happen. Because if those things don't happen, then you can still keep Texas in. Like that's got to be the dream scenario for them. Because then you'd have the winner of the Big Ten would still be in, the 2 SEC teams, and then Texas would be in because they would have the resume then at that point in time to be in. Because then they'd have a win over number 13 Oklahoma.
Right. And that's
right.
Yeah, then that's probably where we're headed. So not counting, I'll ask you this one too. So we'll talk about Ohio State, Michigan last, but Georgia, Florida State, Washington, best chance to lose the next 2 weeks.
Georgia, you said Georgia, Washington, and who?
Florida State.
I think Washington, because I think they're playing the best team, and I think rematches are really hard to win. That's really what it comes down to for me, Bill. Now, ironically, as I mentioned, I believe last week, the last 2 years, the Pac-12 champ has won in a rematch where they also won the regular season game.
Right.
So if you follow trends, the Pac-12 champ the last 2 years, the team that won in the regular season won the rematch. The last time we saw that in the Big 12, obviously Oklahoma lost in the regular season to Texas and then got a rematch or revenge. We've seen it in the SEC where Auburn beat Georgia in 2017, then Georgia beat them in the SEC title game. So I just feel like Oregon's going to be a tough team to beat twice. I think Washington's capable of it. I do.
Right.
I won't be shocked if Washington beats Oregon again, because I think Oregon played really well against Washington and still lost.
Right.
Like repeating how well they played that game is not going to be easy, especially since Washington's going to have a little bit of film on them, So, I just Louisville to me is going to have a tough time beating Florida State, I believe. I mean, I like Louisville. I like this football team, but they're not as good as these other teams. Like they don't even if they beat Florida State, they're not even at 11, 12-1. They're not in my conversation for being in the playoff. They're just not.
Florida might have a better chance to beat Florida State than Louisville. And I'm saying that in a weird way because it's at the Swamp, backup quarterback battle.
It's a rivalry game.
Could get goofy. It was a one-score game last year. I remember I stayed up late and watched that one last year, Brian. It was Travis and Anthony Richardson running around.
I was stuck in an airport last year watching that flipping game.
Yeah, so there's a case there. Yeah, so and then Georgia, I mean, obviously they're not going to lose this week. And then they could lose to Alabama.
I don't think they will, though.
I don't think they will either. I'm with you.
Yeah.
So,
I think we're having this SEC conversation, but I think at the end of the day, it's going to take care of itself.
Right. I think most of it will.
Yeah, I think Alabama's going to lose that game. I just don't think they have enough firepower and offense to win that game. I think they're still the same offense they've been. They're just playing teams that don't play very good defense in recent weeks. I think that's really what it boils down to. So I think Georgia's hitting their peak at the right time. And I think Georgia's, we've talked about this on our show. I think Georgia's injuries this year have made them a much better team because they had other guys that had to step up while McConkey was out. Then they had guys that had to step up with Brock Bowers is out. Well, now they're all kind of back. And that's partly why I'm so confident in Ohio State beating Michigan, because this is the healthiest Ohio State's offense has been since the Notre Dame game. Kind of getting everybody back, and that's kind of how I feel about Georgia. So I think that's going to take care of itself. But here's the scenario I want to ask you, Bill. What happened? What's your Final Four if Oregon beats Washington, Ohio State beats Michigan, and Georgia beats Alabama? Who's your 4?
So Oregon beats Washington.
Right. Okay. So if Georgia beats Bama, they're in.
Right.
If Ohio State beats Michigan, they're in. And then if Florida State beats Louisville, I got to think they're in, right?
Right. So
Let's say Washington beats or Oregon beats Washington.
And Texas?
Texas runs the table. Who's getting
Michigan's straggling there.
Michigan's sitting there.
And Washington are straggling with one loss each.
Yeah.
I think they'll take Oregon. I think they'll stick with their ranking. I think they'll put Bo Nix in the playoff, and then you'd be paired up with Texas would be left out. Texas would be angry.
Deservedly so.
And this is where the Florida State pressure point will be coming in, because they'll be like, Texas is healthy and Texas beat Alabama and Texas is the Big 12 champion and Texas wears Texas uniforms. And they might try to strong on Florida State out of the playoff there. I would probably say Oregon. So we'd have Georgia, Oregon, which would be fun. Dan Lanning gets a rematch, and then Ohio State, Florida State, and Buckeyes would probably roll there. And I think now
it's been a long time since those two teams have played, right? I mean,
they played in a Sugar Bowl a long time ago. Yeah. The Sugar Bowl during 90s? The Cooper era.
Yeah, I was saying late 90s, I think, is the last time those two teams played.
Right. And now if Florida State loses, so we could throw that part into this equation.
Let's say Louisville beats Florida State. Let's just go there.
And then they'll go Georgia, Ohio State, Oregon, Texas. And
that's what I think too.
That playoff would be fun.
Yeah.
Because you'd have Georgia and Texas playing, then you'd have Ohio State and Oregon playing. And if Michigan wins, you put up Michigan in that Ohio State spot. Michigan, Oregon would be a lot of fun too. It would bring back some Dennis Dixon nightmares for some people, but that happens. Or if they played Ohio State, it'd be Anthony Brown nightmares. But either way, it'd be a good infomercial for the Big Ten to have Oregon and Ohio State playing, and a good infomercial for the SEC for Georgia.
There's going to be a good infomercial for the Big Ten, regardless of who wins the Pac-12, because the winner is going to the Big Ten. I mean, the winner and the loser are going to the Big Ten next year, assuming they both hold serve this weekend, which is not a guarantee. Like, this is what could really get interesting, Bill. If Oregon State beats Oregon, and then Oregon goes and beats Washington, that's when you could start to have some fun with how all these things shake out. Because then you could have potentially the potential of Washington still getting in, much like TCU last year, where they kind of back in because everybody else lost in the last 2 weeks.
Right.
So they could get very interesting because Clemson lost late. They lost to South Carolina. That knocked them out. The USC lost to Utah. That knocked them out. And it's just kind of like nobody wanted to be in. And so USC and Ohio State, TCU and Ohio State just kind of backed in to the playoff last season. And both played, had pretty good first rounds, by the way.
Well, let's talk a little Ohio State, Michigan before we get out of here. I do have a Brandon requested a Troche trivia question. I have one for you. We'll do after. I like
it though. Bender Brain
Buster.
I dig that.
Yeah, we'll come with that. So, I wrote a story about this game this week, and as you know, grew up in Central Ohio. I always like to make the joke. My groomsmen were a collection of Ohio State, Notre Dame, Michigan, and we had a Sparty in there. We picked on him a lot. You got to get your diversity quote in there, man. You got to get your diversity quote of friends in there. Well, so we go to this bar in Canton, and it was Munson. It was named after Thurman Munson. I think his son ran the bar. And we go in, and we're all getting our beers, and the Michigan State guy says, Joe Montana's overrated, right? And and we were all Catholic school kids. So you just saw six heads turn, and my wife said, just make sure you're at the altar tomorrow. And then she went, she walked out, and we were there, but it was, from there it was on. Point being, this game's always been a 365 day type talking point for me. And we wrote a piece at Sporting News about how it's going to change, because it is going to change after this year. It's not going to be, there's not going to be divisions. There's going to be 18 teams in the Big Ten. This is the back-to-back 11. I think the 11-0, 11-0 thing will be few and far between. There'll be the possibility of a Big Ten championship game and even playoff games where they play. So this is the last one that has real consequences, real consequences, because I think the loser's not going to the playoff. And, like I said, without Harbaugh, I mean, Bill and I were arguing about this for 2 weeks. I said, that's a huge deal that he's not on the sideline. And I still believe that.
Well, I think we saw that the last 2 weeks. I mean, to me, part of the reason they beat Penn State was because James Franklin's going to James Franklin, right? But we kind of saw it last week when Maryland started their comeback. There wasn't that, okay, who's going to do what they need to do to kind of say, hey, let's go put this team away, like we've seen so many times with Jim Harbaugh. And there's going to be so much back and forth, tough decisions, that they just haven't really been in that situation in the last 2 weeks. And look, I think sometimes people like to discount the importance of coaches in these contests, Bill. And coaches are very important. That's why we're always hammering James Franklin so much, because he does things and makes decisions that impact the game, often negatively for his football team in big games. And whether you like it or not, or whether you want to attribute it to the sign stealing or whatever the case may be, Ryan Roberts on our show today made a point. He's like, look, let's just say Michigan was stealing signs. What did that have to do with Aiden Hutchinson just destroying the Ohio State tackles 2 years ago?
Right.
Nothing. What did that have to do with Ohio State's offensive line or defensive line just getting blown off the ball by Michigan's offensive line, right? I mean, there's been a level of this team has just physically whooped Ohio State the last 2 years, right? And so the interesting thing about it, Bill, is the Harbaugh thing is what we're all talking about. And I do think it's kind of sad, because I grew up in Ohio too. I grew up in Northwest Ohio. So I'm kind of like right in between the two areas. It's not too much, where I live, it's not that much further to get to Ann Arbor than it is Columbus. And I grew up a Notre Dame fan, right? Who's not Catholic. So it's a very interesting dynamic. But you always remember, this was just always the biggest game of the year. for these two teams. And we just going back to the 80s and 90s when you and I were kids, when Michigan had great teams, and you're like, man, this is for the Rose Bowl. There's always something on the line. And then you go back to like the 06 season where like the winner of that game is going to play for a championship and the other one's going to be disappointed going to the Rose Bowl. Now, to your point, they could play in a game like 06 and then have to play again a week later in the Big Ten title game. And then maybe again, if the winner, if the rematch is like the loser wins the rematch, there's going to be years where they may end up meeting again in the postseason, in the playoff, because if they both get in a 12-team playoff, then they win enough and then they're playing each other again. And it kind of takes away from some of the uniqueness of the winner take all approach of this game. And I don't necessarily like that, to be honest with you. Especially if it's a rematch in the Big Ten title game. I wouldn't mind it as much if it's a rematch in the postseason, because I mean we've seen that before. We've seen like Illinois and Michigan. I mean all the way back in '89. When they had their rematches. We've seen these Duke, North Carolina, these rematches. I remember when the Fab Five, when Michigan beat North Carolina or lost to North Carolina in the title game. They played North Carolina and beat North Carolina during the regular season at one of those Maui
the Rainbow Classic.
Right? Yeah,
that was just as soon as we get off here, I'm going to go watch the Maui Invitational. I just saw that 8 foot center still plays at Purdue.
But you can get those kind of rematches if you win enough games and you're the two best teams and let's see you play again. Right. But this notion that they're going to potentially play a week later really just does take a lot of the uniqueness out of what this matchup has been for our entire lives.
I talked to John Jansen, the tackle. He played 4 years, started 50 games at Michigan, played against Notre Dame, obviously, played 12 years in the NFL. And he told me point blank, he said the 1997 game, which is going to lead into my trivia question for you in a minute. But the 1997 game against Ohio State, he said, I played 12 years in the NFL, played in playoff games, played here. He goes, that was the most violent and physical game I ever played in. Mm-hmm. And then you go back and look at the dudes on the field. It was Jansen, Hutch, Katzenmoyer. One of the things that the Notre Dame, Michigan, at least to me, the Notre Dame, Michigan, and why I was selfishly hoping that Notre Dame, Ohio State would become a thing is like when I went to that game earlier this year, I was like, this is amazing. Watching these two teams play. And, I know Ohio State and Notre Dame only played 5 or 6 times, but I know most of the details of most of those games. Right. I know what happened. I know who scored the touchdowns. Michigan, Notre Dame, the same way. I mean, I know exactly where I was. We were all crowding in a buddy's house, a bunch of Catholic kids, a couple Michigan fans, a couple Ohio State fans, everybody sprinkled in. And we remember watching Rocket Ismail run the kicks back. Yeah. 2 of them. He kicked to him twice.
Which never happened against Michigan. I mean, that's the whole reason they kicked to him in the first place. Bo was like, nobody returns kicks against us.
So they kicked, and those games were special in the Midwest because the Notre Dame game to me signified the beginning of fall. It was an amazing game. School just started, those kind of things. And then the Michigan-Ohio State game was kind of like, okay, Thanksgiving, now we got to do this winter thing and put our winter coats on, which is never fun. But I think this game will be fun. Despite everything that's going to happen, that could still happen off the field with Harbaugh. I think when these two teams line up, you're going to have 2 elite defenses. I picked Ohio State to win 22-17. I probably shouldn't spoil that because I'm doing the pick show with Bill tomorrow. But it literally could go either way on one turnover or 1 or 2 plays. And those are it could be it's going to be a lot like what we watched when Ohio State played Notre Dame.
Yeah. This is going to be a lot like what we grew up watching from these games. I mean, you talked about the Notre Dame Michigan games back when they played in the 80s and 90s. It was always that kind of back and forth game. It was never, like what we've seen from Ohio State and Michigan in recent years. I mean, I'm just thinking back to when I was a kid, and Lou Holtz, Notre Dame wins 19-17. The next year they win 24-19. The next year they win 28-24. The next year with Desmond Howard, Michigan wins 24-14. They tied the next year. Notre Dame won the next year 27-23. Michigan won the next year 26-24. And that's kind of how I remember these Ohio State and Michigan games growing up. And I think this game is going to be a lot like that. And I think it's fitting if it does turn out like that, because it's like if it is the final version of this game with the current feel that we've talked about, it will be good to see it be more like a throwback game where it's a trench game in the cold, whose line's going to be the toughest, whose running back is going to make the biggest play, whose linebacker is going to make the biggest stop,
Right.
and then whose quarterback is going to make the most clutch throw. And that's what we grew up watching in this rivalry. And I do think it's going to be like that. I want to bring up one last thing about this game to you, Bill. I've had a bunch of people say, man, like there's a lot of pressure on Michigan. And I've actually said this. I think the most pressure in this game is on Ohio State. Because could you imagine the vibes of going around about for Ryan Day if he not only loses a third straight game to Michigan, but does so with Jim Harbaugh sitting at home? He loses to Sharon Moore. Like, I actually think there's more pressure on Ohio State right now. I still think they're going to win, but I actually think there's now more at stake. Because if Michigan loses, it's kind of like, yeah, well, they didn't have their head coach, and there's been all this drama, all these distractions. Of course they lost. You know what I mean?
Right.
Ohio State loses with all those things true, with Jim Harbaugh sitting at home and Ryan Day, with all this stuff going on. Boy, it's going to get really noisy with the fan base in Columbus if Ohio State, because they're just on, maybe it's just Twitter. You tell me if the people around you are that way, Bill, but like every Ohio State fan I know, they're just assuming they're going to win this game on Saturday.
They haven't lost 3 in a row to Michigan since 1995 to 97. And and not just, it's not just the numbers there. Now you go back and look at those 3 games, right? And I remember all 3 of them very well. Ohio State 95, national championship caliber team, loses. That was the Shimunga Biaka-Batuka game, 313 yards rushing. 96, Ohio State, again, national championship caliber team. They lose to Sean Springs, slips on a slant route. Ty Streets takes it to the house. Michigan wins. 97, the game I just referenced, was the Charles Woodson game, basically. Mm-hmm. It was, he made 3 plays in that game. You just talked about it, Brian. Like, he literally made the 3 plays: the special teams play, the offensive play, and then the defensive interception in the goal line. They haven't experienced that in a long time. I got a call last year when I was driving back from the game from my best friend's dad, who's a Notre Dame fan, by the way, and a reasonable guy. Like, he's like a mentor to me all my life, and he said, Billy, on the Fox telecast, they're chanting, "We want Urban," because that game was in Columbus in the post-game show. They wanted Urban after 2 losses. I mean, Ryan Day is 50, I think, I got it right here. I did 55, let me make sure, 55-6. But the 2 is what they care about here.
Right.
And if it becomes a 3, I absolutely believe. So I'll present it to you this way. There's more pressure on Ohio State. But they're not going to fire him. They're not.
Well, it's not that they're going to fire him. It's just because let's not forget that John Cooper was gone 3 years after that last game of those 3. And what happened to me, it was the culture became so toxic that it was almost impossible for them to recover, which is like what happened with Gus Malzahn. It didn't matter what Gus Malzahn did. It was never going to be good enough once they turned on him. And that's kind of what it boils down to.
They will turn on him. You got a point.
That's the thing that I'm saying.
You're nailing that. Now, I think the fallout from a loss and the program-wide questions will fall on Michigan if they lose, because the way I'm seeing this play out is if they lose, they go to the Orange Bowl, they play Louisville probably, and then we got to do, is Harbaugh going to leave? What's the NCAA going to do? How much farther does this Watergate-like college football scandal story go?
Mm-hmm.
If they win, we still do all those things, but they're getting ready to play like a Florida State or Iowa, and they'll beat Iowa. Both of these teams will beat Iowa. But so the program-wide implications fall a little bit harder on Michigan, but the pressure, and you bring up an interesting point. I didn't think of it that way, that after that 97 game, I think Ohio State won the next one, then they lost, and that was it. They won in 98. They actually beat Tom Brady. And but it didn't, they didn't get to where they needed to be with John Cooper, even though
here's my thing about it, though. In a 4-year stretch, John Cooper went 11-2, 11-1, 10-3, 11-2, finished ranked 6th, 2nd, 12th, and 2nd. And in 3 of those 4 years, a loss to a team in Michigan kept them from playing for a title, right? Within 2 years after that last game of that stretch, he was gone, meaning there was no patience for him. Like the first time he had a downfall, he was out because of that. And so if you're Ryan Day, are they going to fire Ryan Day because he lost 3 in a row to Michigan? No. But you're going to get to the point where the only thing that's going to save you is a national title. And you better not have a down 9-3 season, because then you might be gone. You know what I mean? Especially with a new AD coming in, because you don't know if he's going to have your back the way that Gene Smith did. There's all these type of things that factor into it, because you and I both know Ohio State fans. There's certain unforgivable sins. And losing to Michigan's bad enough, losing 3 in a row, but losing to Michigan with everything going on, it's going to be like, hold on a second.
If
like,
they lose to Sharon Moore, it's going to be different. It's
Yeah.
going to hit really hard. So,
Yeah.
but I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be fun. We'll have a lot of coverage over at Sporting News. I promise you that. I got like 4 stories I've written.
You're going to be there, right?
I will be there. I'm educating people on the. I looked back, another part of this, and then I know this is Notre Dame Irish breakdown, but the other part of that, because I know like all the Michigan Notre Dame stuff and the Ohio State Notre Dame stuff too. I was saying the 10-year war is amazing when you look back at it. Like, they had 4 games over a 4-year stretch that were decided by a combined total of 7 points with a tie in there.
Mm-hmm.
It was incredible. So, well, Brian, I was going to ask you, I'll get us out of here on this one. Here's my Troche trivia question. I'll borrow his. Michigan, and we talked about that 1997 game. They beat Notre Dame 21-14 that season. It was one of those tight, just like you said, a game that we'll probably watch on Saturday. Can you name either Notre Dame player that scored a touchdown in the first half and the Irish led 14-7?
From 1997?
Yeah, the 1997 Michigan Notre Dame game. I'll give you a hint.
Yeah, I know who scored the first one for Notre Dame. I just met him a couple weeks ago.
Right, Ron Paulus threw a touchdown to
Bobby
this guy.
Brown.
There you go.
Brown.
Can you name the other one
that scored for Notre Dame?
It was on a 2-yard run.
I can.
Here it comes.
He did not finish his career playing this position for Notre Dame, but I believe the second touchdown was a right up the middle run from Tony Driver.
Tony Driver, very well done. And
he was a big time recruit for Notre Dame, man. They thought he was going to be a dude. He ended up finishing his career playing safety.
There you go.
Yeah.
So they led and the Michigan guys that scored touchdowns in this game were, if you want to turn down the clock, Clarence Williams. Ty Streets gets his second mention on this podcast, so he's happy somewhere. And Chris Floyd, the fullback. I've talked to Chris a couple times. He's a very good dude. So that's a throwback to when I was a little bit younger. I remember that game, though. It was another typical, like you said, that's why I hope Saturday's like that, because it'll be a game that I remember growing up with where, man, one score, one play, one kick, one
you
play
can always
that
point to that one play, like, wow, that fourth down stop, that forced fumble, that you know, like you start thinking of the names from it. You know, Tim Biakabatuka, Tyrone Wheatley, Carlos Snow. It's a name from my childhood in this matchup. You know, you think of all the great receiver Michigan. I always remember like the great Michigan receivers against the great Ohio State corners, you know, from the 90s and vice versa. So I do hope it's a classic matchup. I said this, Bill, my last question for you. We talked about this earlier today, and our comment was, I do not see this game being like it's been in recent years. Either way, you know, because we've seen this game kind of, it hasn't been an overly competitive game, like as far as like in several years. I think you'd have to go back to would it be 2016?
That was the last close one.
Yeah, and most of them have been, you know, like Michigan dominated the last two. The two before that, Ohio State won 56-27, 62-39, 31-20. And then the 16 game was close. And then the 2 years before that were, you know, convincing Ohio State victories. I said this, if a team wins by a similar margin to last year, it'd be Ohio State. I don't see Michigan being able this year to go score on Ohio State like that. I think it would be one of those things where if the dam breaks for Michigan and they get behind, I could see just
Ohio State pouring it on.
Yeah, turnover here, you know, and that's where the not having Harbaugh factor to say, guys, we're fine, settle down, we're okay. Right. You know, where Sharon Moore's got to be over there dealing with the offensive line when the head coach would otherwise be, you know, or he's not dealing with the offensive line and somebody else is, and that's as bad too. I think if there is a blowout like that, it would actually be Ohio State that would do it.
I agree. I don't think Michigan will win this game by more than 10. But here's the thing. Like I said, picked Ohio State. I didn't take anything. I didn't take as much as other people take from last week because I was like, once that clock hits 0, both of those teams are going to say we won. They didn't like they're not dwelling on Maryland.
Right.
They're not dwelling on Minnesota. They might be dwelling on, okay, is this guy hurt? Is this guy hurt? Roman Wilson went down. Michigan had a tackle go down. Ohio State's trying to get Tommy Eichenberg healthy. That's what they start worrying about.
Did Proctor play this weekend, by the way? Did he come back for them at safety against Minnesota?
I don't,
because I know they're trying to get him back too. I wasn't
sure.
No,
they don't have Ransom. They didn't have Ransom, but then they gotta do that. So yeah, I mean that's what I remember being at this game one year, and we were like last year. Everybody watched Blake Corum all during warmups. He had 2 carries. So once they get on the field, all that figures it out. They start playing, and we'll see.
And we've seen this before, Bill. I mean, wasn't it a couple years ago when Ohio State smacked? What year was it? Was it 2019 when Ohio State smacked Michigan? No, it wasn't then. What year was it that Ohio State smacked Michigan? And it was 2018 when they blew Michigan out in 2018. A week before, they barely beat Maryland. Remember that 52-51 shootout where that running back for Maryland just went off in that game? Like, what happened the week before doesn't, to me, like you said, Michigan's not going to be dwelling over that loss. My point about bringing up is Ohio State's getting healthy. And they're getting healthy, and now you're seeing what their offense is capable of when they're healthy. And that's more of what I mean by the momentum. But no, Michigan's not going to lose to Ohio State because they struggled with Maryland, just like Ohio State didn't lose to Michigan in 2018 because they struggled with Maryland the week before. And that game to me was a lot more they might lose than what we saw from Michigan this past weekend.
Right. And to clear that up, Proctor should play this weekend.
Okay. Good.
So, and he may have a club of some sort. Who knows?
Which will be perfect visual for what I think this game is going to be.
Right.
Because you and I had this discussion last week. I do not think Michigan's defense is as good as people. It's not a top 3 to 4 defense. It's still very good. I think last week somewhat showed that. However, this is still 2 very good physical defensive football teams with playing against 2 not very good, just okay offenses is really what it boils down to. So at the end of the day, I think this game is going to be determined by whose offensive players and whose quarterback steps up and makes the most clutch throws. That's, to me, what this game is going to come down to, because you're going to have to earn every yard and every score, in my opinion, this game. And somebody's quarterback is going to have to step up and make some big-time throws. That's how I think this game is going to shake out, in my opinion.
Yep, I agree. So, it'll be fun.
We good? It's going to be an interesting couple weeks, man. You're going to have some big time. I mean, that's what excites me about this year's conference championship schedule slate, Bill, is there's a lot of – normally these games are just kind of boring and anticlimactic, but there's going to be a lot on the table in this year's title games for a lot of teams, assuming teams can hold serve, assuming Louisville can hold serve against Kentucky this week and Florida State can hold serve against Florida, those type of things. Oregon can beat Oregon State. Championship weekend is going to be a lot of fun. A lot of fun. It's going to remind me a lot of 2021, with the Big 12 and the SEC and all that other kind of stuff.
It'll be the best one we've had in a few years. I'm definitely looking forward to it. So you'll have to check us out. We have our prediction show tomorrow. I think Bill Reed took the lead on me, but I'll catch him tomorrow. He knows that.
Well, I have caught Andrew McDonough on the IB ranking.
Yeah, there you go.
Caught him and passed him last week. He's been kicking my butt all year, but I finally caught him. But that's going to do it, everybody. Bill, thanks so much for joining me today. Going to be a lot of fun. We'll be back next week, you and Bill, next Tuesday night, breaking down sort of the final rankings before the conference championship. It's going to be very interesting to see where the loser of this Ohio State and Michigan game falls. Do they stay within striking distance if enough teams lose in championship weekend? Because that's the thing, too, is the loser of this game is going to be sitting there saying, what can possibly happen to allow us to kind of back into this thing, over this next, hey, let's go soon. Big Ten loser, go Sooners, go Cardinals.
Right. Yeah, I put that article together next week. I always do all the scenarios, and it's one of my fun, the most fun articles we put together, and we'll have plenty of them for that week.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, for Bill Bender, I'm Brian Driscoll. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. If you haven't done so already, make sure you hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell on YouTube. I think you're going to enjoy the shows that they have coming up. These guys are going to preview, dive even more into Ohio State and Michigan and all the big games coming up this weekend. So for Bill, I'm Brian. Have a great rest of your night, everybody. We'll talk to you again here very soon on the CFB Nation podcast.